The pen scratched, a sound like a mouse scrabbling behind a wall. It was the only sound in the Duke of Harrowmary's study, a room so steeped in silence it seemed to drink noise from the air. Everett, the Duke in question, did not look up. He was staring at a column of figures that represented the slow, orderly bleeding of his warda's inheritance, a matter of grim duty. His steward, Mr. Fletcher, a man whose face had been weathered into permanent concern by a lifetime of serving dukes, cleared his throat. "Ah, your grace," Fletcher began, the words careful, as if placing fragile glass upon a shelf. "Ah." Lord Ashworth was most particular in his letter. "Ashworth is always particular," Everett murmured, his eyes still fixed on the ledger. He noticed everything. He noticed the faint tremor in Fletcher's hand, the scent of rain on the old man's coat, the way the late afternoon sun failed to penetrate the oppressive gloom of the library. His life was a catalogue of such joyless observations. He speaks of the girl, your grace of Miss Lavinia. He speaks of the necessity of a stable home, a feminine influence. Everett's hands stilled. The quill hovered, a tiny black hawk over a field of numbers. He finally looked up, and his eyes were the color of a winter sky before a storm, a flat, unforgiving gray. A feminine influence. He repeated the words tasting like ash. "You mean a wife, Fletcher. Let us not dress the sow in silk a duchess. Your grace would silence all such concerns. It would secure your guardianship beyond any doubt." A muscle worked in Everett's jaw. He placed the quill down with unnatural precision. "I have spent the 10 years since my father's death discharging duties. I have paid his debts, restored his tenants' cottages, and taken on the wardship of his closest friend as orphan child. I have done everything this title has demanded of me, and it has demanded my entire life. It will not have this. It will not have my name joined to some simpering debutante who will fill this house with noise and expect me to feel something about it." He rose from his chair, his tall frame casting a long shadow that swallowed the hearth. "Tell Ashworth I am fulfilling my obligations. Lavinia is safe, fed, and housed. That is the beginning and the end of it." Fletcher held his ground, a small stubborn rock against which ducal waves had broken for decades. Her uncle, Mr. Vane, does not see it so. He has been making inquiries, planting seeds of doubt. He paints a picture of a lonely child in a cold, bachelor's house, overseen by a man buried in ledgers. The Duca's voice dropped, losing its heat and gaining a dangerous chill. "Then let him paint. I will not marry. Not for the trustees, not for Vane, not for the title." He walked to the window, his back to the room, and stared out at the manicured lawns of Harrowmere, a landscape as perfectly ordered and devoid of joy as his own soul. "I'd rather die a bachelor, Fletcher. See that you remember it." The steward bowed his head. "Very good, your grace. But men are slow, child, and dukes are slowest of all, and grief and duty make fools of the cleverest of us." He believed his will was a fortress, but it was only a wall, and a wall can be breached when the thing you are protecting is not behind it, but on the other side, about to be lost. He said he would rather die a bachelor on the 1st of March. He was engaged before the month had ended. 150 miles away, Frances Wright was living her own quiet death. It was the death of a livelihood. The Marden School for Young Ladies was closing, its benefactress having succumbed to a winter cough, and her heir having no interest in the education of girls. Frances stood in the empty classroom, the air thick with the ghosts of chalk dust and recited poetry. Her world had shrunk to the contents of a single trunk. She was a schoolmistress and a good one. She possessed a quiet competence that was often mistaken for a lack of spirit. She knew how to manage unruly girls, balance household accounts, and her penmanship was a thing of beauty. She also carried a private guilt, a small, hard stone in her heart. A year prior, a young pupil, terrified of her domineering father, had run away. Frances had found her, cold and weeping, in a barn 2 miles from the school. She had brought her back, and for her efforts, had been accused by the Girola's father of filling his daughter's head with notions of independence. The charge had not stuck, but the stain of it had lingered, a faint scent of smoke that clung to her reputation. She was now 27, respectable but precarious, with no family to speak of, and savings that would not last the summer. Her father, a country solicitor, had left her with a sharp mind, an appreciation for the precise meaning of words, and very little else. He had taught her to read contracts and parse ledgers, skills of little use to a woman seeking a position as a companion or governess. A poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. Her last remaining hope was a letter to a distant cousin of her mother's, a housekeeper at some grand estate in the north. It was a humiliating plea, dressed in the polite language of inquiry, but a plea nonetheless. She sealed the letter, the wax, a small red wound on the paper, and tried not to think about the future. The future was a locked door, for which she had no key. The letter that arrived 3 days later was not the one she expected. The paper was heavy, creamy, and bore a ducal crest that made her breath catch. It was not from a housekeeper. It was from a man named Fletcher, steward to the Duke of Harrowmere. It was terse and bewildering. It requested her presence at the estate on a matter of urgent and delicate business. It spoke of her reputation for discretion and capability, citing a Mr. Hobbs of her home Villasia, the very solicitor who had taken over her father's modest practice. It offered to cover all her travel expenses. It made no sense. Dukes did not summon dismissed schoolmistresses. She read the letter 3 times, her mind, trained to find the hidden clause and the subtle trap, searching for the trick. There was none she could see. There was only a blunt, inexplicable summons. With her trunk mostly packed and her options dwindling to zero, Frances wrote back a simple, dignified acceptance. What, after all, did she have to lose? The journey north was a journey into winter. The soft greens of the south gave way to stark, wind-swept hills and skies, the color of slate. Harrowmere appeared, suddenly, a vast stone edifice rising from the moorland, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out at the bleak landscape. It was a place of immense power and, Frances felt with a shiver, immense loneliness. The carriage crunched to a halt on a gravel drive so wide it could have been a parade ground. She was met not by the Duke, but by the steward, Fletcher. He was older than she had imagined, with kind, tired eyes. He led her through a great hall where their footsteps echoed like stones dropped down a well. The air was frigid, the fires in the massive hearths laid but unlit. Suits of armor stood sentinel in the shadows, their metal dulled with a fine layer of dust. It was a house that was not breathing. His Grace will see you in the library," Fletcher said, his voice a low murmur, as if afraid of waking something. The library was the heart of the house's coldness. Bookshelves soared to a carved ceiling, but the room felt less like a place of learning and more like a mausoleum for words. The Duke of Harrowmere stood by the window, a silhouette against the grey light. He turned as she entered, and Frances felt a jolt, a strange, internal clang of recognition. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, but he carried himself with an ancient stillness. It was his eyes that held her. They were the same color as the winter sky outside, and they held the same distant, unapproachable chill, but they were also profoundly, startlingly observant. She felt his gaze take in her worn traveling dress, the ink stain on her finger she had failed to scrub away, the disciplined set of her shoulders. She felt seen, and not entirely, in a comfortable way. He was a man who noticed things. A man who noticed the servanta's tired hands. A man who noticed the laughter pitched a shade too loud. And he noticed her. He noticed the way she held her head, a quiet defiance against the world that had tried to bow it. "Miss Wright," he said. His voice was a low baritone, devoid of warmth or welcome. It was simply a statement of fact. "Ah, Your Grace," she replied, her own voice steady. She would not be intimidated. She had faced down furious fathers and hysterical schoolgirls. A duke was just a man, albeit a very large and imposing one. He did not gesture for her to sit. He did not offer tea. He dispensed with pleasantries as if they were an unaffordable extravagance. My steward has made inquiries. You were a schoolmistress. You are literate, numerate, and of good character. You are also, I understand, without a position. Each sentence was a flat stone laid upon the ground. Francis felt a flash of irritation. A rather stark summary of my life, Your Grace, but an accurate one. A flicker of something, a surprise, interest, passed through his eyes, so quick she almost missed it. He had expected deference, perhaps a touch of desperation. He had not expected dry honesty. "A starkness is efficient," he said, "and I find myself in need of efficiency. I have a proposition for you, Miss Wright." A position, of a kind as she waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of a grand clock in the corner, each second a drop of time falling into an endless pool. Require a wife," he said, the words utterly stripped of romance. Require one by the end of the month. The position comes with the title of Duchess, a generous settlement, and complete authority over this household. In return, you will provide this house with a respectable mistress, and my ward, with a stable maternal presence. It is a business arrangement. Your affections will not be required, nor will mine be offered. You will be, for all intents and purposes, the highest-ranking servant in my employ. Do you understand? Francis stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined, this was not one of them. It was insulting. It was cold. It was transactional. It was the most astonishing thing she had ever heard. She thought of her empty purse, of the locked door of her future. She thought of the cold dismissal from the school, the humiliation of her dwindling options. Here was an offer, not of shelter, but of a fortress. A cold, lonely fortress, but a fortress all the same. He was watching her, his head tilted slightly, waiting for her shock, her grateful tears, her horrified refusal. He was a man used to being the center of any room, the sun around which all other bodies orbited. He had made his offer. Now she was supposed to react. Her mind, the solicitora's daughter's, mind took over. It pushed aside the insult and saw the structure of the deal. She saw the gaps, the unstated terms, the places where power could be held or lost. Before I answer anything, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was as quiet and precise as his had been, "you will tell me the truth, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story. Why do you need a wife by the end of the month?" For the second time, that flicker of surprise crossed his face, this time staying a moment longer. He had expected to dictate terms to a desperate woman. He had not expected the desperate woman to demand them of him. A slow, unwilling smile touched the corner of his mouth, a ghost of a thing that vanished as soon as it appeared. Very well, Miss Wright," he said, a new note of respect in his voice. You wish for the truth. Then you shall have it." He told her about Lavinia, about the contested guardianship, about the Uncle Julian Vane, and his campaign to paint Harrowmere as an unsuitable home. He spoke of the trustees and their deadline. He laid out the mechanics of his problem with the cold, dispassionate clarity of a general explaining a battlefield. He spoke of duty, of obligation, of the promise he had made to his dying friend to protect his child. He spoke of everything except feeling. Frances listened, her gaze unwavering. She saw the trap he was in, a cage built of honor and responsibility. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had been taught that warmth was a weakness his position could not afford. The coldness was not him. It was armor he had worn for so long. He had forgotten how to take it off. When he finished, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with the weight of his confession. "I see," she said finally. "You are not seeking a wife. You are hiring a shield, a blunt assessment, he conceded, but not an inaccurate one. Then my conditions must be equally blunt, Francis replied, taking a step forward. The solicitor's daughter was now fully present in the room. If I am to be your shield, your grace, I will not be a decorative one, hung on a wall to be admired and ignored. I will have the authority you promised, and it will be absolute. The household, the nurseries, the education of your warda, they will be my domain. Your steward will answer to me in these matters. You will not countermand my orders or undermine me, especially not in front of the staff or the child ahay. He nodded, his eyes narrowed, listening intently. A second, she continued, her voice gaining strength. A Miss Lavinia's parents. They are not to be ghosts in this house. Their portraits will not be taken down. Their memories will not be buried. A child's grief needs air to breathe, not a tomb to suffocate in. Jetta. I will not conspire in erasing them to make your life more comfortable. At this time, he flinched. The shot had landed. It was a truth he had not wanted to face. He had been treating his friends in memory like another ledger to be closed and filed away. Ah, and third, she said, her voice dropping slightly. Ah, and this is the most important. You say my affections are not required. I accept that. But you will not require me to perform any. There will be no pretense for the benefit of the servants, no charade of a happy couple. We will be what we are. Two people in a binding arrangement for the protection of a child. Our dealings will be honest. If you cannot agree to that, then I must respectfully decline your most unusual offer, she finished, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just dictated terms to a duke. A man who could buy and sell her entire world 100 times over. She had expected him to throw her out. Instead, he was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on her face. He was seeing her now, not as a solution, but as a person. A person with a spine of steel and a mind as sharp as his own. He was a man who understood contracts, and he had just heard the terms of one he had not anticipated. And he found, to his own profound astonishment, that he did not object to a single one. He had inherited more debts of feeling than of money, and had discharged both badly. This woman, this quiet schoolmistress, with ink on her finger and iron in her soul, was proposing a transaction based on truth. It was the only currency he had left that he truly trusted. Your conditions are stringent, Miss Wright, he said slowly. They are clear, Your Grace. There is a difference. He gave a short, sharp nod. So there is. Very well. I agree to them, all of them. He extended a hand, not for her to kiss, but as a man would to seal a bargain. Do we have an agreement, then? Francis looked at his hand. It was a strong hand, capable but unadorned. The hand of a man who worked, even if his work was with numbers and not with soil. She placed her own hand in his. His grip was firm and surprisingly warm. We have an agreement, Your Grace, she said. And so, Frances Wright, the dismissed schoolmistress, was engaged to be married to a duke. She had walked into Harrowmere with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a heart full of carefully managed despair. She now possessed a title, a fortune, and a purpose. But as she looked around the vast silent library, at the cold hearth and the shadowed corners, she knew she had not yet earned a home. She had simply been given the keys to a grand and beautiful prison. Her job was to see if she could teach it how to breathe again. The wedding was as cold and efficient as the proposal. It took place in Harrowmeria's private chapel, a place of chilling beauty, with only Fletcher and a grim-faced solicitor as witnesses. Frances wore a simple dress of dove-gray silk, purchased for her by a maid on Fletcher's orders. Everett wore the same severe black coat he wore every day. They spoke their vows in low, clear voices, the words echoing in the empty space. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, they did not kiss. They simply looked at each other, two signatories to a contract, and nodded. She was now the Duchess of Harrowmere, The name felt like a costume she had not yet learned how to wear. Her new life began the moment she stepped out of the chapel. The entire household staff was assembled in the great hall. Dozens of maids, footmen, cooks, stable hands, all turned towards her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and awe. She was an outsider, a nobody, who had suddenly become their mistress. They were waiting to see if she would break. Everett stood beside her, his presence, a silent, formidable wall. He made the introductions with his usual economy of words. This is your new mistress, the Duchess of Harrowmere. Her authority, in this household, is my authority. You will accord her the same respect." It was a stark command, not a warm welcome. Frances saw the flicker of resentment in the housekeeper's eyes, the skepticism on the butler's face. They had served a duke. They were now being asked to serve a schoolmistress. She did not try to win them over with smiles or false sweetness. She knew that respect in a place like this was not given. It was earned. She simply met the housekeeper's gaze and said, "I will require a full accounting of the household ledgers in the morning, Mrs. Gable, and a tour of the kitchens. I understand the fires have not been lit in the west wing for some time. See that they are, please. All of them." Her voice was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of command. Mrs. Gable, a woman who had intimidated lesser mortals for 30 years, found herself nodding. "Ah, yes, Your Grace." The first battle was over. It was not a victory, but it was not a defeat. The true challenge, however, was not the staff. It was the child. Lavinia was 10 years old, a small pale girl with enormous dark eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow of the world. She had her father's dark hair and her mother's delicate features. Frances met her for the first time in the nursery, a vast room at the top of the house that should have been full of light and laughter, but was as silent and still as the chapel. The girl sat on a window seat, staring out at the bleak moors. She did not turn when Frances entered. A governess, a harried-looking woman named Miss Finch, fluttered nervously. "Lavinia, dear, the Duchess is here to see you." Lavinia said nothing. Her small back was a rigid line of defiance. Frances dismissed the governess with a quiet word. She did not approach the girl. She walked around the room, her eyes taking everything in. It was a room full of expensive toys that had never been played with, beautiful books that had never been opened. It was a room of offerings, not of love. On a small table, she saw a book of botanical drawings, its cover worn, its pages filled with elegant sketches of wildflowers. It was Lavinia's mother-house. Frances walked over to the window seat and sat down, leaving a respectful distance between herself and the child. She did not speak. She simply sat, sharing the view of the endless empty landscape. Minutes stretched into a quarter of an hour. The only sound was the wind keening around the eaves of the house. Finally, a tiny voice, sharp as a shard of glass, broke the silence. "You're not my mother." "No," Frances said softly. "I'm not, and I will never try to be. Your mother was Eleanor. She loved you very much." The girl flinched, shocked that this stranger had spoken her mother's name. Everyone else spoke of her in whispers, as a late Duchess Frenda or a poor Eleanor. No one just said her name. "My name is Frances," she continued. "I am your guardian now, along with the Duke. That is all." Lavinia turned her head just enough to study Frances with a sharp, suspicious gaze. "The Duke doesn't want you here. He told Fletcher he'd rather die a bachelor." The words were meant to be a poisoned dart, and they were. They struck a place deep inside Frances that was already bruised. Our girl, the echo of a cruel cousin's words from years ago, dismissing her as a permanent fixture in her family's home, a useful piece of furniture. Now she was the unwanted wife of a duke. But she did not let the hurt show on her face. She had trained herself for years to be a placid surface, no matter the turmoil beneath. She met the chield's hostile gaze with a calm, level one of her own. "And yet here I am," she said simply. And so are you. It seems we must find a way to exist together. Ah, she rose and walked to the door. I have asked for the fire to be lit in here. It is too cold for you, Oz. She paused, her hand on the knob. That book, she said, nodding towards the botanical drawings. Very beautiful. Your mother was a talented artist, Ta. Then she left, leaving the girl alone in the silent room, the unexpected words hanging in the air like dust motes in a sudden shaft of light. That evening, Julian Vane came to dinner. He was everything Everett was not. Charming, effusive, his face wreathed in a constant smile. He greeted Frances with a flourish, kissing her hand and proclaiming her the saving grace of Harrowmere. My dear Duchess. You are a breath of spring in this solemn old place. I cannot tell you how relieved I am. My poor dear Lavinia needs a woman's gentle hand. His eyes, a warm, friendly brown, crinkled at the corners. But Frances, the solicitor's daughter, saw something else in them. A flicker of calculation, a landlord's assessment of a property. Dinner was a tense affair. Everett was a block of silent, disapproving ice at the head of the table. Thane carried the conversation, telling amusing anecdotes about London society all the while, subtly probing, testing Frances's defenses. He spoke of Lavinia's a delicate sensibility and her admirable stoicism. As she is so like her dear mother in that, he said, his voice dripping with false sentiment, so self-contained, never demanding. It was a tragedy born of a whim, you know. He turned to Frances, his expression one of profound sadness. They were on their way to fetch a pony for her birthday, a silly, extravagant thing she had set her heart on. If she had not been so insistent, well, one cannot dwell on such things. Frances felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty dining room. She saw the lie, a masterfully crafted piece of cruelty designed to poison a child's heart against herself. She looked at Everett, but his face was an unreadable mask. He had heard the story before. He had probably believed it. Men do not always see the weapons hidden in soft words. Later that night, Frances lay awake in her cavernous bedroom, a room connected to the Duca's by a heavy oak door that remained, and would always remain, closed. The house was settling around her, groaning under the weight of its own history. She thought of the silent, angry child in the room down the hall, a child who had been told her own desire had killed her parents. A child who was now punishing herself by wanting nothing, by becoming as cold and still as the house she lived in. She had not come to Harrowmere for love. She had not come for a home. She had come for survival. But as she lay in the dark, listening to the lonely cry of the wind, she realized her bargain was not just with the Duke, it was with the ghost of a girl in the nursery. And it was a bargain she had no intention of losing. She had entered a cold house. Her task was to find its heart and see if it could be restarted. It was a task for which she had no training, only a stubborn refusal to be defeated. She stayed. Days bled into weeks. Frances's life at Harrowmere found a quiet, steady rhythm. She did not try to storm the fortress of the household's traditions. Instead, she began to patiently unpick the seams. She started with the cold. On her orders, fires were lit in every room. The great, echoing spaces began to fill with a tentative warmth. Curtains that had been drawn for years were pulled back, and afternoon sunlight, pale and wintry though it was, streamed into the long galleries, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Mrs. Gable and the staff watched her with grudging respect. The new Duchess was not a grand lady who gave vague, emotional orders. She was practical. She reviewed the ledgers and found a dozen small extravagances and 100 small neglects. She did not scold. She simply issued new directives. Better quality flour for the kitchens, new blankets for the servants' quarters, a mending of the roof over the stables. She ran the house, not like a duchess, but like the capable schoolmistress she was, and the household, long adrift under the Duca's benign neglect, slowly began to respond. It was a ship finding its rudder. Everett watched it all from a distance. He would find her in the library, not reading novels, but poring over estate maps. He would see her speaking quietly with the head gardener about the neglected rose garden. He would hear the distant, unfamiliar sound of a maid humming as she worked. He had hired a shield, a figurehead to satisfy the trustees. He had not expected a general who was quietly, methodically reclaiming his entire territory from the grip of apathy and gloom. His perception of her sharpened with each small thing she got right. He had intended to keep her at arm's length, a necessary but remote part of his life, but he found himself drawn to her presence. He began taking his tea in the small parlor she had claimed for her own, a room that now held a vase of winter branches and was warmed by a cheerful fire. He would sit in silence, reading a newspaper, while she did her needlework. They rarely spoke more than a few words, but the silence between them was no longer the frigid void of his study. It was a shared quiet, a comfortable space. One evening, he came into the parlor to find her mending one of Lavinia's dresses, her head bent in concentration under the lamplight. Her face, in repose, was softer than he had realized. There were tired lines around her eyes he had not noticed before. You work too hard," he said, the words coming out more abruptly than he intended. She looked up startled. The dress was torn, Your Grace. It is a simple enough task. I do not mean the dress," he said, walking over to the fireplace. I mean the house, the staff, everything. I hired you to be a duchess, not a steward." "And what is a duchess?" she asked, her needle pausing. "If not the chief steward of her own home?" "I am doing the job you employed me for. It is not what I thought I asked," he admitted, his back to her. He was looking into the fire, but he was seeing the slow transformation of his home. "I did not expect effort." Francesca's hands stilled in her lap. "I did not expect effort." It was the plainest, most unadorned compliment she had ever received, and it struck her with more force than a dozen of Julian Vania's flowery phrases. It was an acknowledgement, it was recognition. It was the first time in a very long time that anyone had truly seen the work she did, rather than just the result. For a moment the guarded schoolmistress was gone, and she was just a woman who was tired, and who had just been offered a cup of cool water in a desert. Was this what it felt like to be wanted? Not for a name or a title, but for oneself? The thought was so dangerous, she immediately pushed it away. This was a bargain, nothing more. Her greatest challenge remained Lavinia. The child was a small, locked box. Frances did not try to force the lock. She simply sat with it, day after day. She brought her own work to the nursery, the household accounts, letters to be answered, and sat at a table while Lavinia stared out the window. She never demanded conversation. She never asked the girl to play. She just was a quiet, constant, undemanding presence. One afternoon, she found Lavinia staring at her mother's book of botanical drawings. The childish finger was tracing the outline of a snowdrop. Frances said nothing. She left the room and returned a few minutes later with a fresh sheaf of drawing paper and a set of charcoals, which she placed on the table next to the book. Then she went back to her own work. She did not mention the paper again. 2 days later, lying on top of her ledger, she found a new drawing. It was a hesitant, clumsy sketch of a single snowdrop, but it was unmistakably alive. It was the first creative act Frances had seen the child perform. It was a seed, pushing its way through frozen ground. She picked it up and held it as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She did not thank Lavinia or praise her effusively. She simply tucked the drawing into her own book, and the next time she saw the girl, gave her a small, quiet smile, a smile of understanding. The thaw began not with a flood, but with a single drop of water. Lavinia started speaking to her, not in full sentences, but in fragments. A question about a word in a book, an observation about a bird at the window. Frances answered each one with simple, direct honesty. The breakthrough came during a storm. A great, roaring beast of a storm swept down from the north, rattling the windows and moaning in the chimneys. In the middle of the night, a crash of thunder, loud as a cannon shot, shook the entire house. Frances, jolted from a light sleep, instinctively thought of Lavinia. She grabbed a dressing gown and hurried to the nursery. She found the girl sitting bolt upright in her bed, her eyes wide with terror, her small body trembling. Miss Finch, the governess, was trying to soothe her with platitudes. There, child. Ida's only a bit of weather." Frances dismissed the governess. She sat on the edge of the bed and simply took Lavinia's cold hand in her own. The girl flinched but did not pull away. It is a very loud storm," Frances said, her voice calm and low. "Ada's all right to be frightened. Amama was afraid of thunder," Lavinia whispered, the words a secret she had held for a year. "Ah, was she?" Frances asked gently. "Ah, what did she do?" "Ah, she would sing," Lavinia said, her voice barely audible over the howl of the wind. "Ah, him! About a rock? A rock of odds?" Frances guessed. Lavinia nodded, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her pale cheek. Frances began to hum the old familiar tune, a steady anchor in the raging storm. After a moment, a tiny, wavering voice joined hers. They hummed together in the dark, a duchess and a ward, a stranger and a lonely child, until the trembling in the small hand subsided and the girl's breathing deepened into sleep. Frances did not leave. She sat by the bed for hours, her hand holding Lavinia's, until the storm passed and the first gray light of dawn appeared at the window. Everett found her there. He had also been woken by the storm and, on a strange impulse, had gone to check on his ward. He stood in the doorway, unseen, and watched the woman he had married sleeping in a chair, her head resting uncomfortably against the bedpost, her hand still firmly clasped around the child's. He saw the exhaustion on her face, the fierce, protective curve of her body. She was not a shield, she was a guardian. He looked at the sleeping child, her face peaceful for the first time in a year. He looked at the woman who had made it so. He had brought her here to solve a problem of law and inheritance. He had not understood that the true problem was one of the heart. He had thought his house was cold because his wife was dead. He saw now that it was cold because he was. He had sealed it up, locked the doors, and shuttered the windows against the possibility of any more pain. And this quiet, stubborn woman had walked in and, without asking his permission, had started opening the curtains. He backed away from the door, his heart aching with a feeling he could not name. It was gratitude, yes, but it was more than that. It was a terrifying, humbling, and utterly overwhelming sense of need. He had thought he needed a wife. He was beginning to understand that what he truly needed was Frances. The fragile piece of Harrowmere was not to last. Julian Vane, seeing his influence over Lavinia waning, and the Duke's position strengthened by the marriage, decided to force the issue. A letter arrived from the trustee's solicitor. Mr. Vane had filed a formal petition for guardianship, but he had not simply cited the Duke's former bachelorhood. He had escalated his attack. The petition included a damning appendix, an audit conducted by an expert of his own hiring, which purported to show that Everett had been grossly mismanaging the estates tied to Lavinia's inheritance, using her funds to prop up his own failing ventures. The charge was an earthquake. It struck at the very core of Everett's identity, his honor and his duty. He had spent a decade meticulously restoring the Harrowmere finances from the ruin his father had left them in. The accusation was not just a lie, it was an inversion of the truth. He summoned Frances to the library. She found him pacing before the fire, the solicitor's letter crushed in his fist. His face, usually a mask of control, was a storm of cold fury. "He has accused me of theft," Everett said, his voice tight with rage. "He has manufactured evidence to claim I am robbing my own ward." Can he prove it?" Frances asked. Her voice calm in the face of his storm. "The ledgers are immaculate," he shot back. "Fletcher and I have accounted for every penny. But Vania's man has twisted the numbers, recategorized asset transfers as expenditures taz, a masterpiece of fraudulent accounting. To an untrained eye, it looks damning. Frances walked to the desk, where copies of the offending documents were spread out. Her father's lessons rose in her mind. Look for the seam, Frances. Every lie has a seam, a place where the truth was cut and stitched back together crookedly. May I? She asked, her hand hovering over the papers. Everett stopped pacing and stared at her. You. This is a matter for solicitors and accountants. My father was a solicitor. Your Grace, he taught me how to read a ledger. Perhaps I might see something a man of finance would miss. A flaw in the language, not just the numbers. Oh, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. He was a duke. He was used to relying on paid experts, on men of his own station. But the experts had so far been unable to find a definitive flaw in Vania's elegant fiction. He looked at her face, at the quiet intelligence in her eyes, and gave a sharp nod. Do what you can. The trustees will convene here in 1 week to hear the petition. If we cannot disprove this by then, I will lose her. For the next 5 days, the library became Frances's world. She and Fletcher worked side by side, poring over a decade's worth of account books, comparing them line by line with the forged audit. Everett would come and go, a thunderous cloud of anxiety, watching her work, his faith in his own systems shaken to the core. Frances worked with a dogged, methodical patience. She traced every transaction, every transfer of funds between the Harrowmere estate and the properties held in trust for Lavinia. Vanania's accountant had been clever. He hadn't invented figures out of whole cloth. He had simply recontextualized them. A transfer of funds to repair the roof on a tenant farm owned by Lavinia was recorded as a withdrawal for the Duke's personal use. The sale of timber from one of her woods, the proceeds of which were reinvested, was presented as income absorbed into the Harrowmere General Fund. It was on the evening of the 5th day that she found it. The seam, it was a small thing. A footnote in Vania's audit, regarding the sale of a parcel of land 6 years prior. The footnote referenced a codicil in the will of Lavinia's father. Frances frowned. She had read the will. She did not remember a codicil. A Fletcher, she said, her voice sharp with excitement. The original will, not the copy. I need the document itself. The old steward, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, retrieved it from the safe. Frances laid it on the desk, her fingers tracing the dense legal script, and there, attached with a wax seal, was a small folded piece of parchment. The codicil. It stated that, in the event of the sale of a particular parcel of land, the very parcel Vania's audit had focused on, the proceeds were not to be reinvested, but were to be used to establish a charitable fund in Eleanor's name. A fund to be administered by the church. Everett had sold the land, but, unaware of the codicil, had reinvested the money in Lavinia's estate, where it had grown substantially. It was a breach of the will's instructions, but it was a breach born of ignorance, not malice, and it was a breach that had ultimately benefited Lavinia, not him. Vane, however, must have known about the codicil. He had built his entire edifice of lies upon this single, genuine, but misinterpreted error. He was planning to reveal the codicil at the hearing, proving the Duke had violated the will, and using that to give credence to all his other fabricated claims. He was holding the truth as his trump card, ready to play it to validate his lies. He knew, Frances breathed, looking up at Everett, who had been watching her, his face drawn and pale. He knew about this. He let you make the mistake, and he has been waiting 6 years to use it against you. Everett stared at the codicil, his face ashen. He had failed. In one small, crucial detail, he had failed in his duty. The foundation of his world, his own unimpeachable correctness, crumbled beneath him. I will lose her, he whispered, the words raw with a despair that went far beyond a legal battle. It was the despair of a man who believed he had failed the only people he had ever truly loved. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The Duke was gone. In his place was only a man hollowed out by grief and fear. Frances went to him, her heart aching for him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. No, you will not." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a terrifying vulnerability. He will use this. He will twist it. He will make me look like a fool and a thief." The pressure in the room was immense, the ticking clock of the hearing counting down the final hours. In that moment of crisis, the armor he had worn for a decade finally cracked open. "A cannot lose her." "Frances," he said, his voice rough, his hand coming up to cover hers on his shoulder. He clung to it like a drowning man to a spar. "I cannot fail you in this." The words hung in the air between them. Fail you. Not a fail the trustesa, or a fail in my duty, fail you. It was a confession, not of love, but of a deeper, more fundamental reliance. He had made her a partner in this, in the saving of his world, in the keeping of his Harta's last treasure. She had come to Harrowmere as his employee, his shield. She had become his anchor. She looked at his face, at the raw fear and trust in his eyes, and her own carefully constructed walls began to crumble. She had been so determined to keep this a transaction, to protect her own bruised heart from any hope of more. But hope was a stubborn weed. It had taken root in the stony ground of this cold house, and now it was threatening to break through. "Oh, we will not fail," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He thinks he has laid a perfect trap. But a trap is only perfect if the victim walks into it. We will not walk. We will stand our ground. And we will tell the truth." She squeezed his hand, a small, firm gesture of solidarity. He has underestimated us, Your Grace." "He has underestimated me." The day of the hearing dawned gray and oppressive. The trustees, 3 solemn-faced men, led by the formidable Lord Ashworth, assembled in the library. The room had been stripped of any comfort. It was a courtroom, cold and impartial. Julian Vane was already there, exuding a confident charm that set Francia's teeth on edge. He was a wolf who had mastered the art of looking like a concerned sheepdog. Everett stood by the fireplace, a statue carved from ice. He had rebuilt his ducal composure overnight, but Frances could see the strain around his eyes, the rigid set of his shoulders. She stood a little behind him, a quiet shadow. Beside her, near the door, sat Lavinia, pale and silent in a high-backed chair, a pawn in a game she did not understand. Miss Finch hovered nearby, wringing her hands. The proceedings began. Vanya's solicitor presented the case with a slick, practiced ease. He laid out the damning audit, painting a picture of a duke distracted by his own financial troubles, dipping into his warda's fortune to cover his losses. It was a compelling narrative. Lord Ashworth's face grew grimmer with every word. Then it was the turn of Everetta's solicitor, a flustered man named Davies. He attempted to refute the claims, but he was on the defensive, picking at the edges of Vanya's grand structure, without being able to land a decisive blow. The mood in the room was turning against them. Frances could feel it, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. Finally, Vane himself rose to speak. He was masterful. He spoke not in anger, but in sorrow. He painted himself as a man torn between his loyalty to his late sister's husband and his sacred duty to his niece. "Do not claim. The Duke is a wicked man," he said, his voice rich with false sincerity. "A man overwhelmed. This house, for all its grandeur, has been a place of shadows since my dear sister's passing. Is it any wonder that my niece, my sweet Lavinia, has withdrawn into herself? She needs light. She needs warmth. She needs a home, not a mausoleum." He turned his gaze on Frances. "And, while I applaud the Duque's recent and very sudden decision to marry, one must ask if this is a solution or merely a tactic. A marriage of convenience, struck with a penniless schoolmistress to provide the mere appearance of a stable home." The insult was delivered with a sympathetic smile. It was designed to dismiss her, to render her irrelevant. Everett took a step forward, his hands clenched into fists, but Francis laid a light hand on his arm, a silent command to wait. This was her ground. Vane, sensing victory, turned his attention to the child. Lavinia, my dear, he said, his voice softening into a treacly ooze. Tell these gentlemen, are you truly happy here, in this cold, quiet house? With a hurrah he gestured towards Francis, the dismissal clear. The room held its breath, all eyes turned to the small, silent girl. This was the moment Vane had engineered. He expected tears, or a sullen silence that he could interpret as misery. Lavinia looked at her uncle. She looked at the stern faces of the trustees. Then her gaze found Francis. It held for a long, silent moment. And in that moment, something shifted. The fear in Natildis' eyes was replaced by a flicker of the same steel. Francis had shown the Duke on her first day at Harrowmere. She stood up, her small frame surprisingly straight. Her voice when it came was not a whisper. It was quiet, but it was as clear and carrying as a bell, as she opened the curtains. Lavinia, said the three words dropped into the silence of the room. Lord Ashworth frowned, not understanding. What was that, child? The curtains, Lavinia repeated, her voice stronger now. She pointed to the tall library windows, through which gray light was now streaming. They were always closed. The whole house was dark. She opened them. She made the fires burn. She talks about Mama. She says her name. She took a breath, and then she turned the full force of her child's righteous fury on Julian Vane. You told me Mama and Papa died because I wanted a pony. You said it was my fault. Her voice trembled, but with anger, not fear. She told me they died because they loved me. She told me the last thing they were doing was something to make me happy. You lied to me. A collective gasp went through the room. Vania's face, for the first time, lost its composure. The charming mask slipped, revealing the raw, ugly greed. He paled, sputtering. The child is confused. Shays over Rada, but it was too late. The truth, once spoken, could not be unheard. Everett moved then. He did not raise his voice. The cold fury was back, honed to a resource edge. He stepped forward, placing himself between Vane and Lavinia. A human shield. A Mr. Vane, he said, and his voice was the sound of a tomb door grinding shut. You will leave my house. You have lost the authority to speak to my ward, and you will never again have it. My wife, he said the words. And they were not a legal term, they were a declaration, a standard planted on a battlefield. Has shown more care and wisdom in 2 months than you have shown in your entire life. The matter is settled. Vane, exposed and humiliated, stared at him with pure hatred. But the trustees were already looking away from him, their faces set in stone. The tide had turned completely. As a footman materialized to show the disgraced uncle out, Lord Ashworth cleared his throat. A remarkable turn of events, Your Grace, he said, his gaze settling on Francis. There was a new respect in his eyes, but it was still couched in the language of his world. You have proven most useful. This was her moment. She could have smiled demurely and accepted the compliment. She could have hidden behind her husband's title. She did neither. She stepped forward, out of Everett's shadow, and met the old lord's gaze directly. Her own was clear and unwavering. I am not useful, my lord, she said, her voice quiet but resonant in the suddenly silent room. I am her mother, and this is my home. It was not an argument, it was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. She was not the hired help. She was not a placeholder. She was the Duchess of Harrowmere. Yes, but more than that, she was the guardian of this child and the mistress of this house. She was claiming her place, not by the Duke's decree, but by her own right, by the right of the work she had done, the love she had given, the light she had brought into the darkness. The crime was that she had been overlooked. The reckoning was that she would be overlooked no more. Lord Ashworth stared at her for a long moment, and then a slow, deep smile spread across his face. He bowed his head. "Indeed, your grace," he said. "Indeed." The battle was over. The house was safe. The child was free. That night, a profound quiet settled over Harrowmere. It was not the dead silence of before, but a peaceful, living quiet. The fires burned low in the grates, casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls. The storm had passed. Frances was in the library, the scene of their victory. She was not reading. She was simply standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds, her hand resting on the glass. It was cold, but the room behind her was warm. She heard him enter, his footsteps softer than usual. On the thick carpet, he came to stand beside her, not speaking for a long time. They stood together, watching the clouds drift across the face of the moon. He is gone," Everett said finally. The solicitors are drawing up papers that will prevent him from ever coming near Lavinia or her inheritance. Again I am glad," as she said softly. He turned from the window to face her. In the dim, firelit room, his ducal armor was gone. His face was stripped bare, showing the lines of exhaustion, of relief, and of something else, something she had never seen there before. A raw, unguarded vulnerability. He was no longer the Duke of Harrowmere. He was just Everett. "I owe you everything," he began, his voice rough. My honor. This house. "Lavinia, you owe me nothing. Your grace," she started to say, falling back on the familiar formality of their arrangement. Everett," he said, his voice low but firm. My name is Everett." He took a step closer. And I do owe you. But what I feel is not debt." He reached out and took her hand from the cold window pane, his own warm and strong around it. "I told Fletcher I would rather die a bachelor. Do you know why? It was not out of arrogance. It was out of fear. My father, he loved my mother, but his love was a tempest. It was rage and jealousy and grand, empty gestures. When she died, it broke him. I swore I would never be that man. I would never feel that much. I built walls of duty and stone and silence, and I thought they would keep me safe." He looked down at their joined hands. "I was a coward. I was living in a tomb of my own making. And then you came. You walked into the darkest, coldest rooms of my house, of my life, and you were not afraid. You did not demand light. You simply brought it with you." His gaze lifted to meet hers, and the winter sky in his eyes had broken. There was warmth there, now, a deep, aching tenderness that made her heart contract. "I watched you with Lavinia. I watched you with my staff. I watched you mend this broken place with nothing but patience and a quiet strength I have never known. I found myself listening for your footsteps in the hall. I found myself looking for you in every room. I told myself it was gratitude. But gratitude is a debt, Frances. This is not a debt." Frances's heart was hammering. She could barely breathe. This was the moment she had been so afraid of, the hope she had so fiercely suppressed. Do not say it if it is only gratitude," she whispered, her last line of defense. Could not bear it. It is not gratitude," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He raised his other hand to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek with an unbelievable gentleness. When I saw you, in that chair, asleep, holding Lavinia's hand, I understood that my life did not begin when I inherited this title. It began when you agreed to share it. When Vane attacked you today, I felt a rage I did not know I was capable of. And when you stood before Ashworth and said, "This is my home," I knew it was the truest thing ever spoken within these walls. He searched her eyes, his own filled with a desperate, costly honesty. "I love you, Frances. Not because you are useful, not because you are my duchess. I love you because you are the foundation of my house. You are the heart that I had forgotten how to use. The bargain is over. I am asking you now, not as a duke to a hireling, but as a man to the woman he loves. Will you stay? Not as a shield, But as my wife, tears she had held back for years, finally fell. They were not tears of sorrow or humiliation, but of a joy so profound it was painful. She had been the overlooked woman her entire life, the useful piece of furniture. And now, this man, this great and guarded duke, was seeing her. All of her. She did not need words, she simply leaned into his touch, her answer in the quiet surrender of her body, in the tears that he gently wiped away. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a practiced, polished kiss. It was clumsy and honest and utterly real. It was a kiss of homecoming, a promise made not in a cold chapel, but in the warm, living heart of the home they had made together. 6 months later, spring came to Harrowmere. It was not the tentative, fragile spring of years past, but a riot of color and life. The rose garden, which Francis and the head gardener had patiently resurrected, was a profusion of scent and bloom. The great house was filled with light and air, its windows thrown open to the song of birds. One bright afternoon, Everett came home, from a meeting with his tenants, to a sound he had not heard at Harrowmere since he was a boy: laughter. It came from the garden. He followed it and found Francis and Lavinia on their knees in the dirt, their hands covered in soil, a basket of newly planted seedlings between them. Lavinia was chattering away, pointing out the different flowers and reciting their Latin names, a lesson she had proudly mastered. She looked up and saw him, and her face broke into a radiant smile. She scrambled to her feet and ran to him, throwing her arms around his legs in an embrace of unthinking, uncomplicated affection. "Eh, papa," she cried, the name she had recently shyly adopted for him. "Ah, Francis is teaching me how to grow Madeira's favorite lavender." He looked over the girl's head at his wife. Frances was smiling, her face smudged with dirt, her hair coming loose from its pins. The portrait of Eleanor still hung in the long gallery, her memory cherished and spoken of with love, not buried in silence. The dead were not erased, they were honored, and the living had finally learned how to live. Later that evening, as he tucked a sleepy Lavinia into bed, she reached out and took his hand. Glad she stayed," the girl murmured, her eyes drifting closed. "The house was so quiet before." "Yes," Everett said, his voice thick. "It was." He found Frances in their room, the door between their chambers now permanently open. She was standing by the window, looking out at the gardens she had brought back to life. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into his embrace. "A perfect fit." Lavinia said she is glad you stayed. He murmured into her hair. "I am glad I stayed too," she replied, her hand covering his. He had made a bargain, in desperation, seeking a solution to a problem. He had sought a woman he thought of as useful, but he had found something else entirely. He had found the woman who opened the curtains. The woman who was not afraid of the dark. The woman who had looked at the frozen, desolate landscape of his life and had seen the promise of a garden. She had not been a replacement, not a bargain discharged. She became the woman who stayed, and in staying, she had saved them all.